The chiefs, having seated themselves on one side of the lodge, dressed out in their robes and splendid headdresses, the band of music seated and arranged themselves in another part, and the old master of ceremonies, having placed himself in front of a small fire in the center of the lodge, with his big pipe in his hands, and commenced smoking to the Great Spirit. After having removed the buffalo and human skulls from the floor and attached them to the posts of the lodge, and two men having taken their positions near the middle of the lodge for the purpose of inflicting the tortures, the one with the scalping knife and the other with the bunch of splints in his hand. One at a time of the young fellows, already emaciated with fasting and thirsting and waking for nearly 4 days and nights, advanced from the side of the lodge and placed himself on his hands and feet, or otherwise, as best suited for the performance of the operation, where he submitted to the cruelties in the following manner. An inch or more of the flesh on each shoulder or each breast was taken up between the thumb and finger by the man who held the knife in his right hand, and the knife, which had been ground sharp on both edges and then hacked and notched with the blade of another to make it produce as much pain as possible, was forced through the flesh below the fingers, and being withdrawn, was followed with a splint or skewer from the other, who held a bunch of such in his left hand and was ready to force them through the wound. There were then 2 cords lowered down from the top of the lodge by men who were placed on the lodge outside for the purpose, which were fastened to these splints or skewers, and they instantly began to haul him up. He was thus raised until his body was suspended from the ground where he rested, until the knife and a splint were passed through the flesh or integuments in a similar manner on each arm below the shoulder, below the elbow, on the thighs, and below the knees. In some instances, they remained in a reclining position on the ground until this painful operation was finished, which was performed in all instances exactly on the same parts of the body and limbs, and which, in its progress, occupied some 5 or 6 minutes. Each one was then instantly raised with the cords until the weight of his body was suspended by them, and then, while the blood was streaming down their limbs, the bystanders hung upon the splints each man's appropriate shield, bow, and quiver, and in many instances, the skull of a buffalo with the horns on it was attached to each lower arm and each lower leg, for the purpose, probably, of preventing by their great weight the struggling, which might otherwise have taken place to their disadvantage whilst they were hung up. When these things were all adjusted, each one was raised higher by the cords until these weights all swung clear from the ground, leaving his feet, in most cases, some 6 or 8 feet above the ground. In this plight, they at once became appalling and frightful to look at. The flesh, to support the weight of their bodies, with the additional weights which were attached to them, was raised 6 or 8 inches by the skewers, and their heads sunk forward on the breasts, or thrown backwards in a much more frightful condition, according to the way in which they were hung up. The unflinching fortitude with which every one of them bore this part of the torture surpassed credulity. Each one, as the knife was passed through his flesh, sustained an unchangeable countenance, and several of them, seeing me making sketches, beckoned me to look at their faces, which I watched through all this horrid operation without being able to detect anything but the pleasantest smiles as they looked me in the eye, while I could hear the knife rip through the flesh and feel enough of it myself to start involuntary and uncontrollable tears over my cheeks. When raised to the condition above described and completely suspended by the cords, the sanguinary hands, through which he had just passed, turned back to perform a similar operation on another who was ready, and each one, in his turn, passed into the charge of others, who instantly introduced him to a new and improved stage of their refinements in cruelty. Surrounded by imps and demons as they appear, a dozen or more who seem to be concerting and devising means for his exquisite agony, gather around him, when one of the number advances towards him in a sneering manner and commences turning him around with a pole which he brings in his hand for the purpose. This is done in a gentle manner at first, but gradually increased, when the brave fellow, whose proud spirit can control its agony no longer, burst out in the most lamentable and heart-rending cries that the human voice is capable of producing, crying forth a prayer to the Great Spirit to support and protect him in this dreadful trial, and continually repeating his confidence in his protection. In this condition, he is continued to be turned faster and faster, and there is no hope of escape from it, nor chance for the slightest relief, until by fainting his voice falters and his struggling ceases, and he hangs, apparently, a still and lifeless corpse. When he is, by turning, gradually brought to this condition, which is generally done within 10 or 15 minutes, there is a close scrutiny passed upon him among his tormentors, who are checking and holding each other back as long as the least struggling or tremor can be discovered, lest he should be removed before he is, as they term it, entirely dead. When brought to this alarming and most frightful condition, and the turning has gradually ceased, as his voice and his strength have given out, leaving him to hang entirely still and apparently lifeless. When his tongue is distended from his mouth and his medicine bag, which he has affectionately and superstitiously clung to with his left hand, has dropped it to the ground. The signal is given to the men on top of the loch by gently striking the cord with the pole below, when they very gradually and carefully lower him to the ground. In this helpless condition, he lies, like a loathsome corpse to look at, though in the keeping, as they call it, of the Great Spirit, whom he trusts will protect him and enable him to get up and walk away. As soon as he is lowered to the ground thus, one of the bystanders advances and pulls out the 2 splints or pins from the breasts and shoulders, thereby disengaging him from the cords by which he has been hung up, but leaving all the others with their weights, etc., hanging to his flesh. In this condition, he lies for 6 or 8 minutes until he gets strength to rise and move himself, for no one is allowed to assist or offer him aid, as he is here enjoying the most valued privilege which a Mandan can boast of, that of trusting his life to the keeping of the Great Spirit in this time of extreme peril. As soon as he is seen to get strength enough to rise on his hands and feet and drag his body around the lodge, he crawls with the weights still hanging to his body to another part of the lodge, where there is another Indian sitting with a hatchet in his hand and a dried buffalo skull before him. And here, in the most earnest and humble manner, by holding up the little finger of his left hand to the Great Spirit, he expresses to him, in a speech of a few words, his willingness to give it as a sacrifice, when he lays it on the dried buffalo skull, where the other chops it off near the hand with a blow of the hatchet. Nearly all of the young men whom I saw passing this horrid ordeal gave in the above manner the little finger of the left hand, and I saw also several who immediately afterwards, and apparently with very little concern or emotion, with a similar speech, extended in the same way the forefinger of the same hand, and that too was struck off, leaving on the left hand only the 2 middle fingers and the thumb, all which they deem absolutely essential for holding the bow, the only weapon for the left hand. One would think that this mutilation had thus been carried quite far enough, but I have since examined several of the head chiefs and dignitaries of the tribe, who have also given in this manner the little finger of the right hand, which is considered by them to be a much greater sacrifice than both of the others. And I have found also a number of their most famous men who furnish me incontestable proof, by 5 or 6 corresponding scars on each arm, and each breast, and each leg, that they had so many times in their lives submitted to this almost incredible operation, which seems to be optional with them. And the oftener they volunteer to go through it, the more famous they become in the estimation of their tribe. George Catlin, 1835.